Robot Talk is the podcast that sits down with robot enthusiasts from around the world and asks them the questions you always wanted answered. Like, have those robots detected a fault? And how does that thing work? Hello everyone! Welcome to Robot Talk. I'm your host, Claire Asher, and this week we're revisiting the fascinating topic of swarm robotics and finding out how biological systems, from the immune system to social insects, can inspire new approaches to programming multi-robot teams. Before that, I have some very exciting news to share with you. Robot Talk will be returning for another live episode recording this June. I'll be chatting to some fantastic guests all about robotic prosthetics and human augmentation as part of the Great Exhibition Road Festival in London. The event is at the V&A Museum on Sunday the 16th of June, and you can find out more by clicking the link in the episode description or by visiting robottalk.org. So, with all that said, it's time for me to introduce this week's guest. I recently had a really interesting discussion with Danesh Tarapore from the University of Southampton, all about fault detection, division of labour, and robot swarms. Today, I'm speaking to Danesh Tarapore, an associate professor at the University of Southampton working on fault detection and recovery in robot swarms. Hi Danesh, welcome to Robot Talk.
Hi Claire, thank you for having me.
So your work focuses on making robot swarms more resilient by allowing them to detect faults and recover from them, much like real organisms do. And from reading your website, I see that you've kind of taken a number of different bio-inspired approaches to this. So can you give us a bit of an overview of your work in this area?
Yeah, sure. I would love to. Yeah, so if you look at biological systems and the way they deal with these kind of problems, it's quite inspiring for an engineer. Mm-hmm. So for example, if you take the adaptive immune system in vertebrates, so these are a very large number of different types of cells that are constantly adapting to changing environments. And very interestingly, we don't have like a hardwired record of what kind of viruses or the genetic code of the viruses that one might encounter during one's lifetime. But still, the system, this collective, is able to adapt and mount effective responses. So when you get a cold, for example, you're able to sort of recover from that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the system is able to sort of tolerate the cells of the body itself. So the self, in that sense. And as the body itself is changing, so as we age and so on. So this is kind of quite interesting for us because normally the engineered solutions that you would see for fault detection, they would be kind of quite hardwired or brittle. But with biology, you have an example of a collective solution, a collective system that's able to kind of have a very dynamic signature of what is normal. And this signature itself changes over time. So it's very fluidic in that sense. So we were thinking, okay, can we actually use this in robot swarms? So robot swarms are also sort of a very large number of individuals, maybe obviously not as large as the cells in the body, but they also have sort of these characteristics, they have behaviors and so on. And so can we use what we know about the adaptive immune system and how it maintains tolerance in a swarm of robots? So the idea there is that, okay, we take a model of the adaptive immune system that's sort of widely recognized by immunologists. And we say, okay, this is a mathematical model. Now, can I make an algorithm that allows it to work on a swarm of robots? And here also, there are some challenges in the sense that because, of course, cells multiply by dividing, the robots do not.
Right, yeah.
So we kind of have to make some tweaks to algorithms while still making sure that the mathematical model properties are still maintained. And we implement this on our robot swarm. And so this allows the swarm of robots to sort of be able to detect faults in each other, but at the same time tolerate normal behavior And what's interesting is that this definition of normality is not sort of predefined, but it changes over time as the robots perform their tasks. So you don't have to pull out the swarm after a mission is over and reprogram this sort of artificial immune system for the next task. It's sort of a very fluidic, adaptive system.
Yeah.
So this was one of the sort of main approaches that we were thinking about while looking at fault detection in swarms, robot swarms.
It's such an interesting analogy to view the immune system as like a fault detection system, which it makes sense, but it's not kind of a connection that I'd made previously, I guess. And also, I think the interesting thing there is that, like, immune cells are not, they're single cells. They're not intelligent. They're not sentient. They're doing all of this with very little kind of cognitive processing or no cognitive processing.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, so the individual cells are quite simple, and there is an analogy one can make between a sort of a robot of a swarm and a cell, or a collection of cells, or a very simple entity like a social insect that's part of a collective, in the sense that they also have senses, they have some neural circuits.
Yeah.
Which in the case of a robot, it would be sort of whatever code or so you've written it, and they have some actuation capabilities, so some capabilities of changing the environment. And in the sense they are, as a collective, a self-organizing system.
Yeah.
And then they're able to show these interesting properties. So it's kind of interesting both ways. So one is kind of, can we use robots to understand these systems, understand these biological systems? So as Richard Feynman said, what I cannot create, I don't understand.
Yeah.
So you, of course, can have a nice mathematical model or a nice simulation, but the yield test might be that, can you actually physically instantiate it in a sort of a swarm of robots and see that do you get what you would have expected from your model or not, and do you have to make changes in your model? And at the same time, then it's also that, okay, now you have a very cool biological system that you have engineered into a swarm, and now can you use that for the particular task that you want?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So what does a robot do if it detects a fault in one of the other members of its swarm?
Right. Yeah, so that's quite interesting, because that leads me to the next part of the work. So, of course, detecting faults is one thing, but then you need to do something about that. So one thing might be that you may be able to warn a human operator that something is faulty. And so if the robots detect a fault in one of the robots of the swarm, so first of all, because the robots themselves have noisy sensors, so if a single robot says that, hey, I think something is wrong with this guy, then the swarm as a whole may not have much confidence on it. But if there is sort of a lot of robots that are having the same decision, so the swarm can kind of form a consensus on that. So transition from like an individual level decision to a decision at the level of the swarm. So the swarm as a whole thinks that something is wrong, so they would have a much higher confidence. And those cases, there are a number of different options. So one is, of course, you could ask a human operator to intervene. But this may not always be possible depending on the environments in which the robots are operating. But another thing is that, can the robots recover on their own once they are damaged, or once they are being detected as damaged? So this is another part of the work where, if you look at children, for example, we as children do all sorts of sort of little crazy, funny things with our hands or legs. We're kind of just exploring the environment. So if you see sort of a toddler moving around, or seeing how the different ways in which they can move around, and just trying to explore that. So what we think is that what they're doing at that time is trying to build a model of themselves and having some intuitions in mind as to how they can, different ways in which they can move. And then this is quite interesting. So let's say, for example, now you're grown up and you are taking a walk through a forest, but you hurt yourself. So you kind of, maybe you sprain your ankle. So you don't have the sensors in place, or sort of some instruments or x-rays in place, to machines in place to know exactly what's wrong with you. So do a very detailed diagnosis. But what you would do is that try to find a way of walking, let's say, to the nearest hospital. So you might say, okay, if I put too much weight on my right leg, it hurts. So I try to minimize the pain. I hop a bit more on my other leg. So you're trying to use those intuitions to try to find recovery strategies. And you might try out various different recovery strategies until you see something that works. So we said that, okay, this is interesting. Can we apply this to robots as well? So we've done this experiments with sort of a multi-joint robot arm and a six-legged robot where one or more of the legs are damaged, and the robot uses similar sort of these principles. We develop algorithms based on that to recover. So for example, in simulations, the robots will try out various different ways of walking or various different ways of performing a task. And of course, that might be very large. So you may have like a library of maybe 15,000 or so different ways of walking. Of course, you can't try all of them on the robot, right? That's not feasible. But if you then use some algorithms to kind of very intelligently try out different possible behaviors and gradually sort of move in very few trials to something that's working. So that can be one way in which you can recover from a fault or from a damage. And then the idea is that, okay, so this was what I'd done earlier as a postdoc, and we tried it on a hexapod robot and on a multi-joint robot arm as part of a group. So the idea was that, can we now apply this to robot swarms? So as part of my EPSRC New Investigator Award, that was one of the things I looked at, as to say that, okay, so this worked for a single robot, and in terms of the control, it was an open loop control. But what are the challenges in applying this kind of a technique to a robot swarm, so that the individuals can, once they detect that they have been damaged, so they can learn from each other and try to find recovery solutions very quickly. So in a way, taking opportunity of having a large number of robots to kind of distributedly learn and recover faster from these faults.
That's really cool. The concept of kind of reaching a consensus that you mentioned, that's kind of analogous to the waggle dance in bees, right? Kind of group decision making, which I think is really interesting. So you've also worked on division of labour in robot swarms, and my PhD was actually on division of labour in ants. So I couldn't miss the opportunity to ask you about this work. What do you think that we can learn from social insects that will help us to create more adaptable and efficient robot swarms?
So my PhD was on division of labor in robot swarms, so particularly in honeybees. And the interesting thing there is that so the honeybees, they show polyandry, so which means that you have a colony of honeybees and they have a queen, and then the queen goes out and mates with multiple males before coming to the nest to lay her eggs and so on. And then this is kind of an interesting question for biologists, because they ask that, why does the queen mate with so many males to increase the genetic diversity of a hive? And so, because there is a cost involved as well, in a sense that she's going out of the hive, out of the safety of the hive, and so on. So what is the benefit of this? And so my thesis was arguing that there are benefits in terms of having this genetic diversity, which allows the workers to perform various different tasks and to be kind of adapt to different environments very quickly. So for example, if you find yourself in an environment where some resources are becoming scarce, the workers can very quickly switch balance and move to kind of take advantage of certain things in the environment to forage for that kind of resource. So this kind of adaptability that is there in social insects is quite interesting for us as engineers. However, there is a level of caution also here, because if we try to mimic exactly what we see in social insects in our robots, I think we are not going to get very far. And one of the reasons is that we haven't advanced yet in a number of different fields to get our robots as small but still as capable as an individual insect. And so if you look at insects, you have very large number of individuals that are working very close to each other to perform a task. And we won't be able to replicate those numbers exactly in an artificial swarm. So if you look at honeybees, they have hives of 10,000 individuals. If I have a task of, let's say, monitoring a forest, I can't afford to have 10,000 robots working in a forest and working at distances that are seen in social insects, where they operate very close to each other. So in this case, I think that we need to think of new concepts. And so this concept that my colleagues and I are trying to introduce, called a sparse swarm, is where the individuals of a swarm don't necessarily have to be very close to each other, but rather we encourage them to be far away, like maybe thousands of body lengths apart from each other. So if you're thinking of robots in a swarm operating in a forest environment, they may be a kilometer apart from each other. And that's the only way in which the robots can actually successfully be used as a swarm in outdoor applications. Because otherwise, if you think of replicating the density of robots, as you see in social insects, you would quickly find yourself in a very difficult situation, both in terms of deploying such large number of robots, sort of keeping track of them because you don't want to leave them in the environment, and then recovering them afterwards. And there are also related issues in terms of communication, so how the robots communicate with each other. Whereas right now, the robots as part of swarms can communicate as often as they want, and they have existing infrastructure in place. So let's say in your lab, or so you have Wi-Fi and so on. But in the middle of a forest or in the middle of the ocean, you may not have those kind of luxuries.
Yeah.
So you have to explore what kind of technologies you could use in these kind of situations to still sort of apply the coordination algorithms that have been developed, taking inspiration from in the social insects to apply them in the robot swarm, but under these constraints.
So, I mean, you talked about the size of a honeybee colony. Obviously, it's an enormous number of individuals, but there are social insects that have smaller colonies, like bumblebees, for example, or the species of ant that I studied for my PhD. They have colonies in the kind of 10 to 100 individuals kind of scale, so more in line with what you're talking about in terms of these sparse swarms. Have you looked at all at how they do things in terms of whether that can inspire you?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting point. So yes, so there are, I would say, societies of individuals which are much smaller. So we were looking more for inspiration from animal societies like wolf packs and so on. So where they are sort of very coordinated, they are able to communicate with each other over longer distances and so on, and they work as a collective. So of course there are also social insects which don't have the level of sociality you would see in honeybees, for example, but those are also interesting to look at.
Yeah, definitely. And going back a little bit, you were talking about genetic diversity within a colony. How might you kind of implement that on a robot swarm? I guess it would be there being variability in their programming.
Yeah, so there are a number of different ways to think about it, but essentially the robots have some way of representing their control code or whatever, how they're being controlled. So for example, if you think of a neural network architecture, so you have inputs, so sensory inputs that are fed into a neural network. You have some neurons which are processing them, and the outputs are sort of driving the motors of the robot. Very simple architecture. Yeah. And so you can imagine that these neural networks have certain weights, so certain weights between connections, which sort of signify how the network is going to behave. And so one could imagine that this could be different between different robots in a swarm to maintain a certain level of genetic diversity. And this would mean that you may have some individuals which are more specialized in certain tasks than other individuals. And maybe there are some individuals which are sort of hybrid or in between, and they may switch between tasks.
Okay. And so would they work out which task they're best suited to kind of by trial and error?
So that could be one way of doing it. You could also have some a priori information built into them. So for example, it's not too hard to imagine that, let's say you have some robots with grippers.
Yeah.
So they may be more capable of doing tasks involving certain manipulation or lifting some objects, whereas other robots which have more powerful motors may be able to push objects, certain resources to the nest. So some of priori information can be put in. And of course, there's also trial and error or intelligent trial and error, which can allow robots to learn their capabilities and how to best match that to the task that in question.
Okay. And so a major theme in your research is pushing robot swarms out of their comfort zone, out of the carefully controlled research lab conditions and into the real world. And, as you've mentioned, one of the areas you're deploying these robot swarms in is forest monitoring. So can you tell me a little bit about the robots you've been designing for this application?
Right. Yeah. So we wanted to have robots which were sort of operating in the real world as a swarm. And one of the things I mentioned earlier was the question of scale. So we are talking about the robots have to be quite far apart from each other. And in that sense, individual robots have to have some level of autonomy. So it's very cool to have robots that can grasp each other and lift themselves over certain gaps and so on.
Yeah.
But in a real world, in a forest, it's very hard to imagine a robot being able to move, let's say, hundreds of meters to come to assist another robot. So its battery is probably going to run out before it gets there,
Yeah.
and it's not going to be able to finish its mission, right? So in that sense, the individual robots have to have that kind of capabilities to be able to move in these challenging environments. And the other thing that we were struggling with is that we found that it's quite hard to get robots which are not too large, so which are portable, so which can be deployed easily as a swarm, which are low cost, and which can be easily sort of purchased off the shelf. So because of those challenges, so with colleagues, we decided that we try to build the robots on our own to meet these challenges. So the robots have to have powerful enough motors to be able to go over these obstacles. They have to be sort of not too heavy, so they'll be able to carry them on a backpack. And this is also important because you don't want to damage the forest, the ecosystem. And you may be monitoring some very sensitive plants and so on. The other thing is that the robots have to be able to navigate in these challenging environments. So how do you learn to navigate when your camera is like 15 or 20 centimeters off the ground, and almost everything you see is sort of looks like an obstacle, or very often your field of view is occluded by leaves or grass and so on.
Yeah.
So all these are quite challenging. But then if you think about it, okay, I actually have a number of these robots working together, so we can learn from each other. So we might say that, okay, this thing, I'm not quite sure if I can drive through this what I'm seeing in front of me. But if another robot has tried it and said, okay, this looks somewhat green and so on, and it's actually, you can just push through it, you can talk to the other, communicate that information with the other robots, so you can learn in a distributed manner. So it sort of takes what I was talking about earlier about this distributed intelligent trial and error and applies it to a real world setting. Then there are, of course, on top of that, issues involving communication. So as I was saying, you don't have existing infrastructure in the middle of a forest. So how do these robots talk to each other? What kind of communication channels can be useful there? And then on top of that, you have to think about now the coordination algorithms that I apply on my swarm. Can I apply the same kind of coordination algorithms? So there are a number of different challenges that have to be overcome. So it's quite a complex problem. And then finally, there are the applications. So what are the applications that would be of interest? So as engineers, we are quite tempted to kind of think of, okay, this is a very cool platform and this can do all sorts of nice things. But it's very important for us to talk to people who are actually sort of end users or stakeholders. So we have collaborations with people in geography, for example, to see, so what are the forest parameters that they would like to have, and how can a swarm support them in that sense?
So these robots, are the little ground-based robots? Do they have wheels?
Yeah, so there are a number of different ways you can go about that. So of course, a very popular option is legs. So legs are quite advantageous because you can go over difficult terrain. However, you have limited endurance in that because it's consuming much more power just standing up itself.
Right. Yeah.
Using power. And the other thing is that since you have a lot more joints, it's more prone to get damages. So wheels are a better option, but usually just with wheels alone, it may not be enough. So you may need to have some additional components on the robot to help stabilize it in these kind of challenging environments.
And you've also been sending robot swarms into the marine environment to tackle projects like long-term monitoring. So what challenges do you face in that environment?
Right. So this was again another application that we were thinking about, where you could use a swarm of robots or a sparse swarm of robots. So you have again very large areas to cover. It's quite hard to monitor such a large space with a single robot. So you need a swarm of robots. And so one of the first things that we saw when we entered this space was that there was no open source tool available to simulate the wave dynamics in these marine environments and how that would affect very small assets. So like surface vehicles, which are about a meter long or so on.
Yeah.
So of course, if you're thinking about ships or very large boats, there are sort of tools available for that. But for these small, very small vehicles, which are actually much more prone to pitch and roll motions in waves or heave motion in waves compared to large vehicles. So we developed, my team developed what I think is the first open source tool to simulate these wave dynamics very, very quickly. So we're able to run it on a Raspberry Pi as well as the motion of these sort of swarm assets, surface vehicles on those waves. So I think that gave us a platform to then think about, okay, what is the next interesting thing that we can do? And one thing that which we thought would be quite interesting and cool is tracking hurricanes. So of course, hurricanes are very difficult to get. It's very difficult to get information of what's happening inside a hurricane.
Yeah.
And of course, you have some satellite images, but there is a lack of in situ data available on the site itself of what's happening in the hurricane as it's moving through an area. And we were considering what kind of assets would be able to withstand these sort of storms. And one of them is wave gliders. So basically, they are surface vehicles which have a very low center of gravity, and they use the wave motion to propagate. So they have very high endurance. And so one of the studies that we were doing is that how can you use a swarm of these wave gliders to track a hurricane as it's passing through? And then there are very interesting dynamics here because wave gliders move an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude at times slower than a hurricane. Right. So you cannot chase a hurricane, obviously, but you can try using forecasting information that we use. You can try to arrange your swarm in such a way that it gets the most information and tries to reconfigure itself as the hurricane is moving through to sort of reduce the uncertainty in its information. So those were like just to give you an idea of some of the studies we've done. And another thing that my PhD student is looking at now is considering communication, again, with surface vehicles in these marine environments. So again, you have the same kind of sort of challenges as you have a forest environment. You're kind of communicating over very long distances. Your antenna is very close to the surface. Again, as with ocean waves, you maybe have like antenna 1 meter or maybe 5 meters above the sea level, and you have waves. So waves are not very good for electromagnetic wave propagation. So they are absorbing the radio waves. And there are, again, lots of studies which are done with ships. So let's say antenna which is mounted on a ship that would be quite high up and communicating with a tower at the base station. But thinking about the signals propagating so close to the water surface, how would the communication look like? What would be the effects of different sort of wave conditions? So those are things that we are investigating right now.
I guess bringing it all back to social insects, maybe there's not that much they can help you with in terms of these kind of communication issues, because I don't think there are any social insects that live in the sea.
Yeah, so there are, of course, social animals that live in the sea. So which are, again, interesting in terms of the challenges that we are looking at. So, for example, orcopods and so on. So, again, those are also sort of individuals that communicate over long distances. So, of course, social insects are sort of a nice example. And there are some things that we can sort of address with them. But then as engineers, we try to look at what are our other, so biology is full of very, very rich, very interesting examples. So what are other examples that we can look at and learn from? And sort of engineer solutions based on that.
Yeah, that's the advantage you have, I guess, is that you can kind of pick different elements of different systems and bring it all together into something that is bio-inspired, but not direct mimicry, I guess.
Exactly.
Danesh, it's been fascinating chatting to you today. I've been talking to Danesh Tarapore, an associate professor at the University of Southampton. Thank you.
Thank you for having me again, Claire. Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy Robot Talk, I'd really appreciate it if you could share the podcast and leave a review to let us know what you think. And make sure you check out our social media channels to see a photo of a forest monitoring rover from the sparse robot swarm Danesh and I talked about. We're at Robot Talk Pod on all the socials. Next week, I'll be chatting to Vasya Simayaki from Wave, all about computer vision, artificial intelligence, and self-driving cars. Until then, I've been Claire Asher, and this has been Robot Talk. Robot Talk is brought to you by the Hamlin Centre, Imperial College London.